On today's edition of Stories from Real Life with Melvin E. Edwards, our guest today is A.J. Otjen. A.J. Otjen is a 2023 Library of Congress award-winning author known for her compelling storytelling and in-depth research. In Burned Over, she chronicles the extraordinary journey of Montana firefighter Dan Steffensen, capturing the raw intensity of wildfire, the harrowing realities of burn recovery, and the unwavering strength of the human spirit.
He had long talks with God about why can't I just die? This hurts so much. And then when he found out about Ryan, who he also had a great relationship with, and another firefighter who had developed cancer who was young, he said, these men have families, they're young. What are you thinking, God? Dan was 65 years old. He says, I'm an old guy. Oh, I don't have anybody. Why did you pick on these two young firefighters who were young with families? What are you thinking? You should take me.
Let's join today's episode with guest A.J. Otjen.
You are listening to Stories from Real Life, a podcast by engaging storytellers for engaged story listeners. Here's your host, author and journalist, Melvin E. Edwards.
Hello again, and welcome to another episode of Stories from Real Life. I'm your host, Melvin E. Edwards. Thanks for joining me for the podcast where personal stories can have a global impact. As you heard in the intro, my guest is author A.J. Otjen. Hello, A.J., and thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks. Your book is called Burned Over. In firefighter vernacular, what does burned over mean?
It's when the fire comes right at you and burns over you or burns over your engine. So that's what they always say. I've been burned over. Basically, it's a very terrifying word, or the two most terrifying words that you hear on the radio. So,
wow.
Yeah.
Right, so your story is about Montana firefighter Dan Steffensen. So can you tell us a little bit about? Well, we'll be asking about Dan's story today. He couldn't be here, so I'll ask you the details about his life and his story. So why is Montana's weather pattern a unique hazard for fighting wildfires?
That's a great question. Montana is probably the best experiential learning for all firefighters. They go through intensive training. And what's interesting about Montana's weather is we have big storms, and I write about the weather and the storms in the book to try to understand how Dan ended up where he was, and why Montanans in general have to be prepared. We watch the weather just as laymen. If we see the wind pick up, or if we see trees sway, or I even watch the petals of my flowers on my porch start to move a little bit, because wind is everything in fire. And even in these California fires, it was the wind that picked it up and made such a disaster. And it's not just the wind that's in the storm, it's the wind in front of a storm. So wind, a downdraft of a storm can be 60 or 70 miles in front of the actual storm. And this is what you have to look out for. And we have so much fuel in Montana, from forests to grass, everywhere. And understanding how the different fuels work and how fast fires travel depending on the fuel, firefighters have to understand all of this, from storms to weather patterns to fuels. And Montana is just ripe for somebody to strike a match. So,
wow. So your book describes Dan as a man of few words. How did you approach interviewing him? How did you approach interviewing him and getting him to open up about such a traumatic experience?
That was tough. He first wanted it to be a fire book. And so I had to do and I'm an academic. I'm a professor at Montana State University. And so I initially started by just being an academic and doing research on fire and weather and training. And I sort of went to Dan. I said, Dan, this is kind of, this seems like a very academic book, and I don't think it'll be very, I don't know how many people want to read this except firefighters. And then I realized it was not just a fire story. It was a very human story. And I said, Dan, you have to tell me, what this all felt like, what you were going through. And he went, huh? What? Why do I? And so I had to really pry him open and say, what was this? How did this feel, before, during, and after? Because, a year before this happened, he had lost the woman in his life. She had died. So he was already a grumpy old man. It's called the grumpy old man syndrome that a lot of firefighters experience when they're not fighting fires. They don't like to be sitting around not fighting fires. They love fighting fires, actually. And he was especially a grumpy old man because Marnie had died a year before. And so understanding that was a big part of it, and getting him to talk to me about, how he felt, about that was where we began pretty much. And his relationships with the other firefighters, his relationship with the community of Red Lodge, the town of Red Lodge ended up being a very important part of this story. And so when I started talking to the firefighters and the people in Red Lodge, I understood what they were going through because they had such a horrific summer that, they had 3 other tragedies that summer. And that's why it was called, they call it the summer of hell. And when the other tragedies were, ended up being very bad, and they needed him to live after he was burned. He was one of the tragedies and was flown off to Utah and was in a coma for a long time. He had 60% of his body was burned, the 3rd-degree burns, and he wasn't supposed to live. He should have died that night, actually. They needed him to live and heal and come home because they had a huge fire that almost burned down the town. They almost evacuated the town. And then they had a hiker, a graduate of Montana State University that went missing. And they spent all summer, the search and rescue team from the same firehouse as the search and rescue team. They were searching for this, lovely graduate, of Montana State University. Recent graduate, they searched for her all summer, and they finally found her remains at the end of the summer. And then another firefighter had a skateboarding accident where he fell and cracked his head, and he was on life support and eventually succumbed. So all of these things were happening, and they just said, Dan, you have got to live. You've got to come home to us. So understanding what they were going through, that helped me figure out why it was so important for him to live, for him to come home. And he didn't know any of this was happening. So when he realized, how everybody else was feeling, it was easier for me to say, Dan, you need to now know what was going on around you. And so now that you know that, you've got to now express to me what this was like for you. And it helped him open up a little bit. So.
Okay. So your book does highlight the intense bond between firefighters in a small town.
Yes.
Into tell us what Red Lodge is like as a town?
Well, Red Lodge sits on the northern edge of Yellowstone Park. It's actually one of the gateways into Yellowstone Park over the Beartooth Highway, which is, one of the highest highways in the world. And because it's surrounded by fuel, forest, and grass, it's always on alert. So half the town pretty much volunteer. If they're not volunteers for the Red Lodge firefighter community, they're families of. So it's completely connected to the Red Lodge Fire Department. They're all, and so everybody in town knows a firefighter or is a firefighter. It's a very small town, like I think 2,000 people or maybe 2,500 people, and they're just ready. They're always volunteering to take care of each other. They all know each other. They all, and they're just ready to fight fires because that's when fire season starts. That's what they're ready to do. Either fight or evacuate. That's the way Montanans live during fire season. So,
how long is fire season? Well, it's getting longer. It used to start in July and end in September, but now it's in 2021 it started in June, and now it's almost every year it's starting May or June and going into October. So it's dangerous. Wow.
Yeah.
So are they wildfires every time?
Yes, these are. I mean, there is structure fire and there's wildfire, but in Montana, that's the wildfire season. And it's they train, the difference, everybody is prepared. All of us are prepared for a wildfire, but these people train all year round, constantly, for all types of fires. And the training itself is very intense. And that's the difference between a professional wildfire fighter and just, somebody who knows how to put a hose on their house. It's very intense training. And Dan was one of the most trained. He was a trainer. He was a mentor. He had been on many, many national wildfires in California and Utah and Wyoming. So he was a senior wildfire fighter when this happened to him. Yeah. So
what starts wildfires generally? Is it like lightning strikes, people?
Lightning and man. It's so it can be nature or it can be man-made. Yeah, often man-made. So stupid accidents. Campers, people, and the one that was started that almost burned down Red Lodge was by a motorcycle rider who had poked his gas line accidentally, and a spark started a fire, and it was a huge fire. Started in June and lasted until November. They had it contained, but it wasn't out until the snows came. So,
wow.
Yeah. And that's what happens with a lot of fires. Yeah. They get contained, but until it snows. Yeah.
In your book, you note that Dan's burnover was just one of the many horrific tragedies during the summer of hell. And you touched on those, but can you give us more details about those tragedies?
In Ryan's case, the other firefighter, he was another beloved young man with a family, and he was also a snowboard. Red Lodge also has a ski mountain, and he was on the mountain. He was either on the mountain or a firefighter. He was very active, very athletic, always smiling. And nobody could have imagined that he would fall and hit off of his skateboard and hit his head. It just, nobody could think that it would have been Ryan that would have fallen and hurt himself, because he was young and athletic, always outdoors, and it was, and the chief, he also, the fire chief owns several restaurants in town. He also worked for the fire chief at his restaurants. He was a president of the Firefighter Association. So that was just really tragic. And he was on life support for a few days before they took him off life support. And then Tate, she was a well-known hiker. She had hiked all the Beartooth Mountains. The Beartooth Mountains are huge. They're granite. They're some of the highest mountains in Montana, and she had hiked all over Montana, all over the mountains. So she was an experienced hiker. Had gone up by herself many times, knew where to camp. So again, nobody would have expected that she would have been lost, but ended up that she had fallen the very first day in a rock slide and died the very first day. So this, all those weeks that they had looked for, she ended up that she had died the very first day. And, but these search and rescue teams were, and they had helicopters out looking for her, dogs out looking for her, and they just couldn't find her until when they finally found her, and they had the funeral for Ryan in August. That was the same time Dan was coming out of his coma in Utah, which was, when everybody said, okay, Dan lived. Thankfully, Dan lived. Okay, now, Dan, you've got to go through the incredible ordeal of burn rehab, debriding, wound care, PT, which is something that a lot of people really don't want to recover from. Even Dan, there's a whole chapter in the book called "Let Me Die." He kept praying. He had long talks with God, about why can't I just die? This hurts so much. And then when he found out about Ryan, who he also had a great relationship with, and another firefighter who had developed cancer, who was young, he said, these men have families. They're young. What are you thinking, God? I'm old. Dan was 65 years old. He says, I'm an old guy. I don't have anybody. Why did you pick on these two young firefighters who were young with families? What are you thinking? You should take me. I'm sitting here in pain trying to recover, and I'm old and have had a great life. just take me. He really had a hard time dealing with mortality when he was down in Utah. Yeah. So it was difficult.
How did he finally deal with that?
He met the other burn survivors, finally. He always said, they can tell you all day long, but until you see it, you're just not going to accept it. And the burn survivors have a saying called, between the past and the future is acceptance. And Dan had a very difficult time accepting what had happened to him. The nurses and the doctors down there said he was the worst patient. He doesn't ask for help. He refused to do what they told him to do. He kept saying nothing was wrong with him. Leave me alone. But he was in very, very bad shape. In fact, during the coma, he had died a couple of times. His daughter had his DNR, but she didn't bring it with her. She didn't have a copy. So because she didn't have it, they kept bringing him back. They kept resuscitating him, and he kept coming back. So he finally came out of his coma, and then he was, having to deal with depression and pain, and it was just excruciating for him. But once he met a guy named Mark Haley, who was a burn survivor, and many of these burn survivors are amputees, because they were burned so badly they lost limbs. And once he met them, and their attitude was that, look at my life, I'm doing great. He said, well, if they can do it, maybe I can do it. When he saw that they had accepted their new lives, then he finally realized he could too. And that's when he finally accepted where he was in his new life. And he started then, he was the one who would take himself to PT. He used to hate to see the PT guy come and say, we're going to PT or we're going to wound care. He hated them. And then finally, once he accepted his new life, he said, okay, I'm going to wound care. I'm going to PT. Where are these guys? I got to get well. I got to get healthy. I want to go home. He wanted to go home so badly. He just finally got up and got out of bed and got to work to get well. He just decided to do it. Yeah.
He ultimately returned to firefighting after all of that. So what motivated him to go back, and how has his experience changed his perspective on the job and the risk involved?
Well, first of all, you have to realize he became a firefighter late in life. He had always wanted to be a firefighter, but he didn't start until late in life, when he and Marnie had returned to Montana. Thinking they were retiring, but then he found out that there was a volunteer firefighting position, and he said, I think I can do that. So he started when he was 58 years old, and trained and became the senior firefighter. And so he worked so hard to become a firefighter and loved it. So, he said he thought it was over until he realized that he was getting stronger. And there's something called a pack test, where you have to go 3 miles in 45 minutes, carrying 45 pounds. And there was a nurse in Utah that also inspired him, because kept saying, come on, get up. We're going to get you to do that pack test again. And at first, Dan was like, are you kidding me? And day by day, Dan kept walking. He would walk, 10 feet, and then he'd walk 50 feet. And he got to the point where he was walking a mile in circles around the hospital room. And finally, I started writing the book in 2022, a year after he was burned. And then in 2023, it was the fall of 2022, I got this text from him that said 4310. I went, what's 4310? He said, it's my pack test. It's time. And I thought, my God, he's qualified to be a firefighter. But it was like, but the next week he was going back to Utah for more skin grafts. So he was bleeding all the way. Nobody knew underneath his pants that he was bleeding all the way through his pack test. So he's crazy. He's just a nutty guy, determined to go back to what he had fought so hard to become, which was a firefighter. And I went with him to his last skin graft because I wanted to go meet the doctors in the hospital, see the hospital and the honor guard who had, also stood over him in Utah. And everybody down there said, what have you done? He says, well, I passed my pack test. And he was, and they were getting ready to do more skin grafts on him. But because everybody said he was like the toughest guy, he is the toughest guy. and people said if he wasn't so tough, we were lucky that he was so tough, because he never would have survived if he wasn't. But he was back on the line in the summer of 2023, and they said it would take 3 years for him to recover just to get back to normal. But he was fighting fires again in 2023. So that's who Dan is. That's why he's hard. That's why he doesn't share his emotions. It's because he's a tough guy. He just wants to do it. But I think that if you read the book, you'll see that I think I got a lot out of him to tell his story. In fact, too much maybe, because he's the first one to say he's kind of a jerk, or that's not the word he used, but he's a guy who will say, "I am what I am. Take me or leave me," and that's what we put in the book. And I would write certain passages and say, "Okay, Dan, read this. It's a bit harsh." And he said, "What's the truth, isn't it?" I'd say, "Yeah, it is." And he says, "Well, put it in there then." I'd say, "Okay." So that's what we did.
So is he pleased with the final product?
Yes, he is. I knew he was, but I was more worried about all. I felt such a responsibility to the town of Red Lodge, to the burn survivors, to other firefighters. I said, because it became such an important story. It took me 2.5 years basically to write it, and I knew as the more I got into it, the more I realized that it was an important story for so many people. And I felt such a responsibility to get it right for the town, for all these people, that I had stress on myself, and I'm not a narrative writer. I was an academic writer, or I also I'd written children's books, or I had a column in the Billings Gazette. So I told Dan when he asked me to write his story, I said, "Dan, I'm really good with, about 1,000 words, and I've never written a nonfiction novel before." So he said, "Oh, you can do it." And it was his confidence in me that really kept me going. And I felt a lot of stress. So it wasn't the fact that I was worried about him liking it. I was worried about everybody else liking it. So, and they do. I mean, I've had a lot of good feedback from everybody involved in the story. So a lot of stress came off of me when the book was released and everybody read it. I felt very good about it.
Good. So what message do you hope readers take away from your book, Burned Over?
Well, the main thing that the burn survivors say, which is, between the past and the future, is acceptance. A lot of the burn survivors who have read it have told me that it's a very good burn book. This is a good book for burn survivors. It's very inspiring for them. It shows them that, you can, it does get better after you're burned. I've had people tell me that everybody in Montana should read it because it tells you a lot about fires and what you need to do to survive fires, and how fires work, how storms work, how to prepare for fires. But also, I think it's also talks a lot about family and community and how people band together to overcome disaster. Dan's family was kind of pretty much estranged from him or he was estranged from them at the time. And they all came to Utah when they found out he had been burned and probably going to die. They all showed up. They all came, and they came back together for one purpose, and that was to save Dan. And there he was in a coma, and they rallied and were a family again. For him, even though they were separated by distance and by emotion and had been for years. So, it is a book about connecting with family and community to survive. And I even talked to all of them about, well, so have you healed? They said, no, we'll never heal from this, but we do now. We do know now that we can survive anything. There is no ultimate healing because it was just so traumatic, but we can survive. We know how strong we are as a result of this. But both the town of Red Lodge and the family both said this, that we can survive anything if we can survive this. And I think that's a story that a lot of people need to know because they stuck together. They leaned on each other. And they learned, and there was a the Utah psychiatrist came up to Red Lodge and spoke and talked to all of the firefighters. And there's something about the firefighter community that they just, they're tough and they don't talk to each other. They don't talk to psychiatrists. And the national firefighter community has started to include mental wellness in their training. And that's kind of a new thing. And that's something else that's came out of a lot of incidents like this is, you have to take care of the firefighters' mental wellness, not just their physical wellness, because these things are very hard to overcome. It hurts in a lot of ways. Everybody was so down and so traumatized by what had happened that it took a long time for them to recover. Yeah, they needed to talk it out. So
what advice would Dan normally give if he were here to someone facing insurmountable or seemingly insurmountable challenge that you can share on his behalf?
He would say, to ask for help, which is something he doesn't do, never did. That he had to learn to ask for help. It was the hardest thing he ever did was to ask for help, because he just doesn't do that. He hates to admit that he cried. He cried like a baby. And tough guys don't do that, And in the book, we mentioned several incidents where he cried like a baby over things like because he had a feeding tube for so long that he couldn't swallow, and before they let him go home, he had to learn how to swallow again. They would not release him from the hospital until he could swallow, and he practiced and practiced and also he wanted ice cubes so badly, and finally somebody brought him an ice cube, and when they gave him an ice cube, he cried like a baby. There were times when he just needed help, and it was just such an awful ordeal. And for him to admit that he was weak and needed help was so bad. Sorry. Come here. Stop it.
Life in Montana.
Stop it. So anyway, so that would be the main thing is, he would not have, and to realize that there were people who cared about him. I think that he had always sort of pushed people, even to this day, he pushes people away who care about him. He likes to be, he likes to be on his own. He's always been a person who likes to be on his own. And that's kind of why he was estranged from his family, is because he just soon be on his own. He feels better on his own. He does better on his own, in his mind. And he could not get through this on his own. And it was hard for him to admit that. So.
All right, for the final question today, let's talk a little bit more about Dan. We had planned to have Dan Steffensen here with us today, but I understand he's not doing so well. Can you give us an update on his health?
Well, before we published the book, Dan had started having a painful cough, and we found out there was a black mass on his lungs, and went through lots of tests, and he ended up being diagnosed with small cell lung cancer, and that was a year ago. And so now he didn't fight fires last year because he was going through chemo. He would have been fighting fires in California if it hadn't been for this, because he just loves fires so much. He loves to fight fires so much. But so now he's going through chemo again. But Dan's attitude is, I've had a great life. I wasn't afraid to die when I was burned. I'm still not afraid to die. I have people who care for me. I'm living in my home, beautiful Montana. So if anybody ever had pity for me or felt sorry for me, I'd cut their head off. So right now he's, going through chemo again and dealing with small cell lung cancer. And we're all, caring for him and knowing that he's had a great life, and that's his attitude. So,
well, we pray for the best for Dan, and please thank him for his service to Montana, Red Lodge, and to the country. We appreciate it.
You bet.
So please go to the website at podcastreallife.com for more information about my guest and the things that we discussed today, including how you can get your own copy of the book. There will be a link in the show notes. That's it for today's episode of Stories from Real Life. Join us again next time for another chance to learn from each other. Until then, don't forget to shine your light wherever you go.
That was Stories from Real Life. Join us again next week for another great storytelling journey. See you next time.